So
And
yeah,
also,
that's
it's more expensive now because if you are negotiating a weapons contract with the U.S. government, you may as well say it costs more than it does.
and that's what they always do. I mean,
Yeah.
the weapons that the United States purchases are always wildly inflated. And on top of that, there is God knows how much dark money that flowed into Ukraine from 2014 on. Once we got involved in the coup to overthrow their president. And then we armed them and prepared them to fight against the Russians, first in the Donbass, and then second in an invasion that we were provoking on purpose. So, like, yeah, there's lots of money that went through USAID and through the National Endowment for Democracy that funded right wing media outlets to pump up Ukrainian nationalism and anti-Russian sentiment. And this isn't a conspiracy theory. I think one of the accidentally good things that Trump has done recently is open the books on what all of this money is being used for, and we've seen that it's like literal Ukrainian neo-Nazis being given money by USAID to do a podcast about the dirty Jew Mongols in Russia trying to invade pure white Western Nordic Ukraine.
I was just looking at that on transparency.org. Ukraine is ranked 105 or 105th out of 180 countries on the corruption scale. That's pretty high up there.
Oh yeah, Ukraine is hands
it has
down
a score of 35 out of 100, which is like worse than
that's not
D.
a passing grade.
No,
that's a solid F. The D
that's
is
like you
wrote
your
above.
name. That's like you wrote your name on your paper
and turn it in blank.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I don't put much stock in corruption index.
Oh yeah. I mean, this is an absolute. Yeah. It's just to say, like, when you said this is not a conspiracy theory, it's like, that's right. That's just my very first hit. And this is the same. These are the same kind of global watchdogs, which would say Venezuela or Cuba are also like super corrupt and whatever. So it's just to say that there's Ukraine. It does not fare well, even by the standards of the people who are thumping the chest the hardest about freedom and democracy.
Yeah. The deal, the minerals deal, right? The weird, vague minerals deal that Zelensky ended up not signing also commits minerals that, first of all, are owned by Ukrainian oligarchs and are sitting underneath Russian-occupied territory right now, in large part. In large part, most of these rare earths are underneath the Donbass, which is almost completely occupied by Russia at this point, right. And getting a little bit more occupied by Russia every single day. So I have no idea what this was supposed to be, but it didn't happen. Zelensky backed out of it. He got into a fight with JD Vance and Trump on national TV, which was very weird and awkward. A lot of secondhand embarrassment watching this video. So because Zelensky tried to lecture Trump and Vance about anything. First of all, it seems like a wild move for a supplicant. But also, Trump's kind of right. And some of the stuff that Trump said he was right about. He did it in the most boorish and, arrogant way possible, like Trump generally tends to do. I was
going to say, that's not a surprise. Like at all.
Yeah, and he's an idiot, so he didn't really sound very coherent when he was talking. But he did say that, this is a mess that you allowed yourself to get into, that you got your country into, and that you have had the chance to end multiple times and have refused to do so, which is true. It absolutely is true. If you can go back to the Istanbul Agreement, which happened a few months after the invasion, when Russia was, Russia was sitting on a bunch of Ukrainian territory, but taking pretty serious losses and not doing too great. And Putin was willing to make a deal. And that deal was for autonomy and autonomy of the People's Republics, as they're called. It'd still be part of Ukraine, but given the autonomy of self-governing regions, still paying taxes to Ukraine, still in the borders of Ukrainian customs, and still allowed to be exploited by Ukrainian oligarchs and, sending conscripts to the Ukrainian military whenever. Anyway,
basically the Minsk Accords again.
Again, right. Like round 3 of trying to do the Minsk Accords again.
Yeah.
And there would have been, an agreement that Ukraine would never join NATO, and that the Russian language would be protected, because I know it sounds like propaganda, but the Russians in Eastern Ukraine were being persecuted. That's all there is to it.
Yeah, it's really hard to deny that.
And it's really hard to deny it now that the Ukrainian government under Zelensky's martial law has been cracking down on Russian language things. It's like,
and like the Russian Orthodox Church and like,
yeah. I mean, and that's another thing that Trump said, not recently in his really weird, awkward fight with Zelensky on national television, but where he called Zelensky a dictator without elections, which is partially true. I mean, everything about that is true.
Yeah.
Like, it's
the fact that Donald Trump said it doesn't mean it's not true.
Right.
It's just that it's unfortunate that it took Donald Trump to say it, because someone else should have said it already.
Right. So, I mean, like, you can say what you will about the constitutionality of elections not being held under martial law. So I've heard both sides. I've heard that there's nothing in the Constitution that allows for martial law to suspend elections, and I've heard people say that it does. I don't know. I'm not a Ukrainian constitutional expert.
No, but I like when I think about like in the U.S. history, we had elections even whenever the Army of Northern Virginia was like within striking distance of Washington D.C. And so, we couldn't count the votes from Louisiana and from Alabama and from Mississippi and so on. But the election still happened.
Right. And I mean, the people have made this point that during the greatest wars in the history of the world, the democratic countries held elections.
I mean, the Bolshevik Party still had party congresses and Soviet elections in the midst of their civil war.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like, so let's go ahead and say that whatever reading of Ukraine's constitution that people are saying, oh, this is allowed for under the Constitution. Let's say that's correct.
Well, you know what else? I guess I shouldn't. I mean, whatever. I don't want to make a direct comparison because there's nothing about the Bolsheviks and an election in Ukraine or in any other country, which they're not really comparable. So, but comparing the U.S. presidential elections in the Civil War that's good enough, I think. Sure.
But let's say that it is completely legitimate for there to be no elections under martial law. Sure. I mean, I could see the utility in that. That actually makes a certain amount of sense to me. But the way that the Ukrainian government has been behaving under this martial law seems to be excessively dictatorial. And right. Let's just quibble about semantics for 1 second. A dictatorship, the definition of the word dictator, comes from the Roman Republic. When there was a crisis, Rome would go into national martial law. They would appoint a dictator to deal with the crisis. And once the crisis was over, the dictator would step down, and then the republic would be restored.
Right.
So this is what a dictator is. When you're under martial law and you suspend elections and you rule by fiat, that's a dictatorship. So under the very just most basic definition of a dictatorship, Ukraine is a dictatorship right now. And, oh, well, that's what happens sometimes under martial law. That semantics
seems like that would have been a decent response too. Like if the pro-Zelensky camp, including like half of the U.S. political establishment, I mean, really like 2/3 of the U.S. political establishment, if they just said, well, yeah, he's a dictator, it has to be because it's a war. That at least would have been like an honest response.
98% of like liberal politics is properly virtue signaling. And
right.
You cannot do that if you admit that there's a dictatorship.
That's true.
So, I mean, like, okay, Zelensky is constitutionally ruling as a whatever, not dictator.
An elected guy who's in charge.
Strong president. Right. Let's say that that's the case. Sure. What else has been happening what else has been happening that makes me say that that he's been ruling in a dictatorial fashion. And I could go down like a laundry list of things. So first of all, let's start off with the most basic one, which would be the suspension of opposition parties. Not all opposition parties, but opposition parties that...
So the opposition parties, which fall under three categories. One category being anti-war parties.
Right.
Or anybody with an anti-war message. Another one would be any, let's call it pro-Russia parties, like parties of the Russian-speaking Eastern minority.
And or parties that advocate for greater cooperation with Russia, because those have all been suspended too.
That's all. Yes, pro-Russia. Pro-Russia means not anti-Russia.
Right.
And the third one is anybody who thinks that private ownership of the means of production is a mistake. So like every socialist party, the Communist Party, every variant of that, that's all illegal now.
Social democratic parties that wanted to nationalize and not that oppose the neoliberal privatization of Ukrainian resources, all of which are now being sold off to American companies, by the way. Like BlackRock is a big
defender of freedom, I think.
Yeah, defender of freedom. That's what I was going to say. Yeah. But I mean,
BlackRock is a big defender of freedom.
Okay, what about the banning of trade unions? That's another one, right? Then there's the persecution of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, because of it being too close to Russia. And which is, I mean, I am sure that there are prelates within the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that are probably pro-Russian, but this is a very large...
By a certain definition, there definitely are, because there are prelates in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church who don't want a war.
Right. So, I mean, there's a very large minority of Ukrainians that are being persecuted, and their churches having their property confiscated. You're having priests rounded up, put in jail. I've seen videos of like Ukrainian soldiers going into mass of a Ukrainian church and like dragging the priests out and like, waving machine guns at parishioners, like, shutting down mass, which, I mean,
that's until like Israel style stuff right there.
Yeah. Up until a couple of years ago, these people that are breaking up that service would have been members of this church.
Right.
But anyway, so there's that. And then there's the press ganging. Ukraine is having a massive manpower problem right now. And it's not just because they don't have enough people. That's part of it. But a lot of it is because nobody wants to fight. And not nobody, obviously. Some people do. There are people that are joining up. But not enough people. There aren't enough people who want to fight to fill the vacancies caused by casualties and desertions. So they're press ganging people. Like you have groups of men walking around, kidnapping people as they come out of clubs or restaurants or bars, and press ganging them into the military. And that it's gotten so bad that they're even people that should be exempted from fighting in the war because of severe disabilities being press ganged and forced to go into the military anyway. So there's that. Then there's also the Ukrainian Secret Service, allegedly, and I think this is probably true, assassinating domestic opponents of Zelensky, as well as the Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Service assassinating opponents of Zelensky abroad, not just in Russia. I think that someone tried to assassinate Robert Fico recently, and he thinks it was Robert Fico, the president of Slovakia, who's an opponent of the war and an opponent of funding Ukraine. Someone tried to kill him, and he thinks it was Ukraine.
And even Slovakia is a NATO member. So it's like, it's much more complicated than just you are either pro the West or you're pro Putin. Like that's the way it's presented. And it's very clearly not that. It's very clearly way more complicated.
Yeah. And, and somebody blew up Nord Stream, and I'm going to just go out on a limb and say it was the United States.
Yeah.
But, that has CIA handprints all over it. But they blamed the Ukrainians. Which, I mean, like, because think about it. If a NATO country attacked one of its allies, a billions and billions of dollar piece of infrastructure that provides a country with sorely needed gas to heat their homes, then that might be a bigger problem than if poor little Ukraine did it because they were scared, right?
Yeah, definitely.
But I mean, like, and Germany is, what is Germany going to do, right? Germany has since 1945 been a puppet of the United States, just wholly and thoroughly, until recently. We're seeing some pretty interesting developments.
Until recently, maybe.
Maybe. Right. We'll see. But yeah, so those are all things that make Ukraine seem pretty dictatorial to me. Now, what else could we talk about when it comes to Ukraine? I know that I've got a lot of stuff rattling around in my head.
I mean, that's not the main stuff.
No, there's a lot more. Let's talk about the manpower crisis. Moving into that, right? Yeah. So when I said that there are press gangs, you've got that as well, but you've also got open warfare against the press gangs going on. You've had like, I'll link in the show notes some of my resources here, but if you follow the Events in Ukraine Substack, he is a Ukrainian living in Canada who writes about things that happen in his parents' homeland. And one of the things that he constantly talks about is violence against people who are trying to force not just press gangs, but recruiters who show up to, and say, hey, look, this is your name. You've been drafted. You're on the conscription list. And then violence breaks out. And right. You get people who are resisting being conscripted, being beaten to death. There are several instances of people being beaten to death or beaten until they were hospitalized, which seems counterproductive if you need warm, healthy bodies to go fight Russians, but trying to make an example out of them, I guess. But you've seen recruiters being killed by Ukrainians who are resisting them. Like one of the stories I saw was a guy rode down some recruiters on horseback and killed them with a pistol. And then in some instances, someone blew up a recruiting office. When I say recruiting, I mean conscripting. They're not looking for volunteers. They're conscripting. Sorry. There's a difference. Recruiting recruits volunteers. They're fighting with people that are conscripting Ukrainians. Conscription is wildly unpopular in Ukraine, which is why Zelensky is refusing to recruit 18 to 25-year-olds. Because right now, they're not recruiting anybody below the age of 25.
Yeah, because there's like an exemption because officially that's the future of the country. But at a certain point, like if you're going to maintain this war, I think that's what you would need to do. It's a separate question whether or not you should maintain this war. I just mean that the war effort has to, you have to rely on people. And like, what is it, like 20,000? No, not 20. 20 million Ukrainians have fled in the last 3 years.
Is that many?
I think so. I think it's like 20 million Ukrainians living abroad.
Well, let's just...
I'm going to look that up.
As far as, there's a demographic problem, but on top of that, there's an enormous desertion crisis as well. This is actually something J.D. Vance brought up in the weird argument that they had with Zelensky on national television. Is that he says, you guys can't even recruit enough people to continue the fight. What are you talking about? Ukraine is done. You guys are done.
Okay. I mixed these numbers up. It's 20 million fewer people since 1991.
Oh, okay.
5.2 million since the war started.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and there's a massive problem recruiting. They don't meet their recruitment numbers. They reportedly get about 20,000 people per month recruited into the Ukrainian military. And that is reportedly by Ukrainians. This isn't like a Russian statistic and not enough to replace casualties and desertions.
Right.
I think that the thing with desertions too is it's hard to tell exactly how many people have deserted because there's a massive problem with corruption in the Ukrainian military. So you have people paying officers not to report them missing. You've got some officers taking money that should be being paid out to troops and keeping it for themselves. and obviously they're not going to report when troops are missing, having gone AWOL or deserted. And also, there's a sort of a gray area in the enforcement of desertion rules because of I don't exactly know the reasoning behind it. I think it has a lot to do with not wanting to demoralize the country further, so they don't actually report desertions in a lot of instances. So people,
the Associated Press says that some 90,000 deserters officially, but the unofficial number is much, much higher.
Right. I've heard 250,000, like a quarter of a million desertions last year. Not
that would make
total.
a lot more sense. 90,000 seems very low.
Yeah, 90,000 seems incredibly low. So you've got that many desertions, and then on top of that, you've got what has to be astronomical casualties, specifically in this last year of warfare. I know Zelensky says 40,000 Ukrainians have died, which to me sounds fake. Maybe 40,000 before the offensive in 2023, or before the Russian offensive in 2024. But I think I've seen somewhere that it's probably more like Ukraine has around 90 to 100,000 casualties, and Russia has around 100 to 200,000 casualties, which makes sense. The attacker is always going to suffer higher casualties when attacking fixed emplacements.
Yeah.
But it's certainly far, far less on the Russian side than the 700,000 casualties that 700,000 casualties and 400,000 deaths that Ukraine is officially reporting, and far more than the 40,000 deaths and 200,000 casualties that Ukraine is reporting. So there's really no telling. Ukraine lies out of its ass.
Well, according to Donald Trump, millions. It's which is also very obviously that's not true either.
That's not true. I've seen some estimates that say that Ukraine's deaths are probably as high as 500,000, with casualties as high as 1 million. I don't necessarily know where they got those numbers from, but I do think that the U.S. military guesses, based on the way that they gather data, that the Russian casualties are around 90,000 to around 90,000 official, and up to including the not actual Russian members of the military, like using people from the People's Republics, which have been volunteers from there. There's probably another 10, 20,000 worth of dead. But anyway, those whatever casualty numbers there are, the Ukrainians can't replace them. There was a showpiece brigade that was trained in Paris, trained and outfitted by the French, the Anne of Kiev brigade. Yeah, Anne of Kiev brigade, or Kiev, whatever. Anne of Kiev brigade, which the 155 Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. So they took how many of them? I think like a couple thousand to Paris. 2,000 soldiers went to France. When I say Paris, it's obviously not. They didn't take them to the Champs-Élysées and the Eiffel Tower to train them, right? They were at some camp in Paris where they were trained up to French standards, which are quite good, and taught how to use the self-propelled howitzers and armored vehicles and Leopard tanks, which are the Leopard 2A4 tank, which is the main battle tank of the German military and of a lot of other NATO countries, which is sort of equivalent to the M1 Abrams. And if you talk to Europeans, it's better. I don't know. I've seen lots of videos of them on the side of the road smoking and flaming from $400 Russian POV attack drone.
That doesn't necessarily make them worse, or they might still be better than the M1 Abrams. I think the bigger point here is that tanks are far less powerful and indestructible than we wish to believe, especially with the changing nature of warfare.
They're still integral, but they are. Yeah. It's kind of like the way that they now they're useful for the way that they used them in World War I and not the way they used them in World War II. But
right.
This brigade, 2,000 soldiers trained in France. They came back, and by the time they got back to Ukraine, 1,500 of them had deserted.